Well, I'm really glad to have you. Thanks for coming by. So, we've known each other for a while, and part of the reason I wanted to have you come down is because I think, in terms of friends I have, the community that I have, you probably would be one of the most knowledgeable people in regard to whether it's Black history, but also racial injustice, and in particular because you work in an industry that it's probably most prevalent, or at least one of the most statistically provable areas when we talk about systematic racism, where it meaningfully exists and has long been a problem. And people sometimes lack context and they lack the reasons why certain things become the way they become and why they stay the way they stay. And so maybe first just tell me like kind of what you do for a living.
I am a defense attorney, and I was a public defender for 7 years prior to going out to private practice last October, September. The practice areas, I started in criminal defense, but they've been expanding. I have some civil rights stuff. So, and then as a result of the protest situation, we are taking up a number of appeal issues, the firm is.
Okay, so right now though, that's kind of an interesting thing. So you started in criminal justice, and the first thing that like this migration into civil rights and now working on behalf of the protesters, what kind of came out of that criminal justice work that moved you that direction?
Well, like everything, there's just a significant amount of interconnectedness. So clients are whole people, right? So if they are treated wrongly by police, there's a lot of situations where they have housing issues or they have employment issues. And people of color, BIPOC community, specifically Black people, especially in Seattle, there's a lot of discrimination. And so how to address and meet the needs of meet client where they are, meet their needs there, and then get them linked to resources that can help address all of those issues.
So then when you go now from that into the civil rights kind of element, I'm curious to know just what work is it that you're doing or that you're hoping to do in that area?
Monetary. So with civil rights, like as far as civil suits, we're seeking monetary damages. And one of the things that's been a direct result of institutional and systemic racism has been the economic deprivation, and it's impacted Black community for a significant amount of time. For example, 1865, emancipation happens. African Americans in this country had 0.5% of the wealth. 2000 something only have 1%. So over that significant period of time, there's not, that's one of it hits heavy, right? It's like, despite the quote unquote shackles being removed, it has not led to what was supposed to have happened. And there are a number of reasons why, and we can talk about that later too, but it's about addressing the economic impact of racism in a white supremacist system.
So give me why. I'm curious to know why.
Okay. So I want to start with a definition as far as when I say white supremacy, I mean anytime there's an elevation of whiteness as a priority over and subjugation of Blackness or anything BIPOC community. So it's not crosses being burned. It's not that. That is that overt thing that happens and everybody's like, oh my gosh, we can have that. Just as a baseline, white supremacy is the uplifting of and prioritizing of whiteness. And that has a real impact. And so there's a couple of framework conversations to have. When we're talking about social justice, equity, it can't be like equality because there has never been a situation where anybody's been equal. If you have been held back for 400 years, you need some things to catch up, right? Part of white supremacy is elevating this ideology of the law so that BIPOC experiences get completely erased. It's like, well, no, if we do this and we do this, we did it for both groups of people. It's like, no, that's not how it happens. If we're talking about context of the situation where there's been a series of intentional acts to give whiteness priority, then doing the same thing for everybody in this particular situation is not going to address the racial equity issue. And so when we want to talk about bringing all of these disparities to an end, we have to have a contextual conversation about how we got here.
Right.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And setting the groundwork, it sounds like, for the understanding that if you're not going to be aware of what has put a person in a particular place, then as soon as you even begin to talk about anything else, you're missing the root causes, the root ailments that have brought someone to this particular, in this moment. When you look at it and you kind of wanting to bring about this greater context, what are the biggest things that you feel like people need to understand in regards to how to go about change, or what are the things that are in people's way that you're like, you're not acknowledging this is not acknowledged, or these things are not a part of the discussion that need to be?
I would start with history. I think that there is a gross lack of understanding about history, and that is an education system quote unquote failure. And again, this is talking about impact, not intent. So we all had really sweet, nice teachers, right? They gave us an apple, they told us we could be somebody sometimes, yeah, whatever. But at the end of the day, if when you walk into class and you hear that Columbus discovered this country, as if nobody else was here when it was populated with over 100 million people, and you learn that, oh, this is brought and introduced these people who were uncivilized, right? And that Europe coming over here was a benefit to them, then you think that what happened as a result is, not that big of a deal. And so what we have here is continuous disrupting of people's lives, and then the erasure of history, right? Like, what do you learn about Black history? What do you learn about Native American history as far as contributions to science?
Oh, none.
None.
Literally none. There were no Black intellectuals. There's no record of any of the other things that we invented, that we contributed to, that in fact we either discovered or made first, and it went under another person's name or whatever. There's none of that history. And that is, I would argue, probably the same today. I would think that's, I don't know,
100%.
but
Yeah.
I'm not a kid anymore, but I'm assuming there's probably not much that's been added to that narrative.
You still have to argue to get, African American history even taught in schools. And mind you, there is no separation between U.S. history and African American history.
You're right, you would call it, yes, exactly.
So let me do this timeline correctly. 1619, land in the U.S. as indentured servants, and there were white indentured servants as well, right? Then 1662, Pardis, legal doctrine, which is birthright slavery. 1671 is the first use of the term white to describe a person. So, and I think that's an important distinction, because understand that the snatching up and kidnapping Africans, bringing them here, chaining people, forcing them to work, was an economic thing. It was, okay, we need this cheap labor to develop this new colony, right, or this series of colonies, and that's what we're going to do. When they figured out that it was very, very lucrative, then comes the addressing of, well, how are we going to keep this a thing? Because they're people, they're indentured servants, and we've got white people in the same status as them. And then, what was it? 1676 was Bacon's Rebellion, where poor white folks and indentured servants who were Black folks teamed up and started addressing the ruling class, right? Rich were like, we can't have that. We can't have them figuring out that they're on the same boat. So what happens? There's no indentured servitude for white people anymore, and then that's right after it becomes a birthright slavery situation. So again, we have this game that the elite class, or rich or whoever, gets to play, where it's constant divide and conquer. And that's what Trump did with the Make America Great Again thing. And so we see that being used again, where we are, the people who are experiencing poverty, lower class white people, are literally being targeted. It's like, okay, well, at least you're not going to be Black. So you're like us as white people, but it's like, you're never going to be rich. Just let it go. It's not going to happen.
Well, what's that even that thing with LBJ, where he talks about, if you can pit the poor white person, when King is marching with people and trying to get Blacks to fight for workers' rights, because he was ultimately against and recognizing poverty as a tremendous root of disenfranchisement, a lack of quality education, a lack of voting rights, all these kind of other systemic issues, and going hey, Black workers need better rights, and they knew in the opposition, if we just can pit poor white people against Black people on race, we can bypass the matter that if actually Black people won these rights, it would improve their quality of life, just knowing what road to take. So seeing that as the case and seeing that kind of trend, what's the next thing that occurs? What's the next, in terms of that part of Black history that's at the root of all this, what's the next kind of steps that we end up walking through?
So 1740 was when the criminalizing assembly and education.
So that's no reading and writing.
Yeah.
No, okay.
Yeah. Can't let you know about where you come from. Can't let you see that you are a person and not an object, right? And so that's when you have the psychological impact, which is what we see in the representations of Blackness in media, which is why it's so interesting that we still don't have a correct or accurate curriculum that explains and attributes the brilliance of Blackness. But I think it's really important to note that, again, this started as a money thing, and then after that, it was the addressing the cognitive dissonance, they're people still, and it's oh no, we make it so not people. And so we have the Constitution being drafted in 1787, and literally in this document that is quote unquote the foundation of this country, it is 3/5 of a person, right? And then it's also important to note that that's where the Electoral College comes from. The Electoral College was a compromise given. It's the North and the South, North was oh, we kind of have to deal with slavery at some point. You can't keep doing this too much. And the South's well, if you want us to agree to this union situation, you have to give us more say, because technically our population is increased by enslaved Africans. And so, that's why it's you get 3/5, they count as 3/5 of a person as far as electoral votes. So the Electoral College dismissing the popular vote in multiple really big deal elections is literally a remnant and a relic of slavery. So when we talk about our history, it's not something that happened in the past, it is still happening.
So the power of the Electoral College is ultimately rooted in the fact that a slave owner or those families that held, those bloodlines that held those slaves had significantly greater voting power because of the slaves they've owned. And then once slavery ended, retained that same power.
Yeah.
Wow, that's fucking wild.
It's a disproportionate, I mean, you see, it's like the populations in the South
Right.
should like, why does California have 54? You know what I mean?
Yeah,
It's like, we have to
exactly.
think about like relatively, it doesn't make any sense. And it's because it's like, okay, we're going to negotiate this thing so that you guys get a heavier weight in elections because they're worried like, oh, you liberals are going to be determining what's going on in the country, which is technically what should be happening, right? Progress should be determinant. But what we have here in this country is we can't move forward because the weights that are literally chained onto us and won't push progress.
And if we look at like the modern thing and say someone is in this role and they're like, we talked about school and the
Yeah.
way curriculum is, right? And the way that there's a sincere imbalance of, like we said, that even that term Black history of just being like, we're not accurately telling history.
Yeah.
That's how we can say that,
Yeah.
right? We're just not accurately telling history. That what that may look like for someone in that particular role is being like, hey, when you have a chance to design curriculum as a teacher, right? Or if you have a chance as a superintendent or a principal or whatever to go about and do the meaningful work of folding in the rest of the history.
Yeah.
So that way you're not an active participant by omitting the responsibility of correcting a long done wrong that, again, orients white people and Black people in particular roles and perceptions of themselves. Because like you said, to read a list of Black inventors, to read
Yeah.
a list of people who have done these tremendous things is so deeply inspiring. Like to be a kid, to be a white kid and go, you got Albert Einstein and you got Neil Armstrong and you
Yeah.
got Thomas Edison and you got, Ben Franklin, and you have all these figures for who you can use as avatars for who you can become. And if you're a Black person, like you said, and you're not actually going to tell the history, well, then I'm going to have such a limited number of choices
Yep.
that my natural imagination and what I could hope to do in my life, not because I don't have the potential, but because it is always harder to think one can do a thing when it's never been done.
Yeah.
It's like no one could run the 4-minute mile, then a dude did it, then everyone could
Yep.
do it, right? It's like having that thing that can set you on a course or hold you, that kind of fixed star that you can follow.
And I have like a list of like Black inventors that I learned about like a few months ago.
Okay.
And I was like crying because I was like, oh, it would have been really awesome to see myself reflected in curriculum as an inventor or, an innovator in any way, or as more than just a creative or an entertainer, because that's what we see
Sure.
Blackness as. So Lewis Latimer invented, he was a Black man, the light bulb and the telephone. Garrett Morgan invented the traffic light. Marie Van Britton Brown invented home security system. Elijah McCoy invented steam engines and lubrication. Patricia Bath was an early pioneer of laser cataract surgery. Granville Woods patented the railway telegraph, which allowed communications between train stations for moving trains.
Oh, sick. Okay.
Otis Boykin invented electronic control devices for guided missiles, IBM computers, and the pacemaker. Benjamin Banneker successfully predicted the solar eclipse. He taught himself astronomy by watching the stars, learned advanced mathematics from borrowed textbooks. Percy Julian pioneered the chemical synthesis of medicinal drugs from plants. Cortisone, steroids, and birth control pills are a direct result of that. No big deal. like, why don't we know that?
Well, it goes to your point, right? That one of the most lucrative things you could do is have free labor. And should you have someone who is innately adept and smart, that you're like, well, okay, fine, we'll let this guy
Yeah.
do this thing. You know what I mean? Like, he's kind of odd. He seems to be smarter than all of us. Like, let's
Yeah.
just let him, whatever. And then when he benefits, like, we're going to benefit. It's never going to go to him. He's never going to get any notoriety. He's not going to see any of the money.
Yeah.
So it also makes sense, too, just to that notion of realizing that function of slavery is to not only suppress a people, but it's also to benefit from their gifts.
Exactly.
To see that what they're innately gifted with is ours for the taking.
Yeah. I have that conversation specifically to say to white people, this is not a new thing, but also hold self accountable, right? Like, you see this happening historically, and recognizing that the silence, the complicity, it all ties into itself. And just because you are not out there, lighting lighting crosses on fire, does not mean that you are not playing an active part in continuation of this legacy.